Good evening, everybody. My name is Lloyd. I am part of ScotSci, which is a science outreach group based in Edinburgh in the UK. Tonight we have Professor Stuart Haszeldine with us to sort of help clear the air and answer all of your questions about fracking, sort of pros and cons, like the environmental impacts and similar. You probably hear lots of stories about it on the news. So we thought we'd put this together so you can try and sort of clear the air and answer any questions you may have. We'll start off with a small short presentation. We'll go over the topics and some of the related sort of areas, and then we will be able to field all your questions that you'll have. Okay, Kat, are you able to do a screen share of the presentation?
Yep, just trying to do that.
Oh, good.
Take it away, Stuart.
Okay, well, welcome everybody that's tuned into this, whether you're live or watching on a recording. I'm Stuart Haszeldine from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And in the UK, we've been looking at the potential development of fracking for probably about 12 or 13 years in commercial terms, and about another 5 years before that in geological terms to see if there's a resource. And at the moment, fracking is suspended in the UK. So several boreholes have been attempted, but none have been successful. So I'm going to try and explain a bit of background, why fracking is of interest, and what are some of the issues involved. And really, this is altogether bound in with part of the energy transition, which the world is going through, from a transition from coal, which Scotland used to burn in abundance, through oil and gas, where we're now 2/3 of the way through our gas reserves, maybe even more, probably about 3/4 of the way through our oil reserves, and we're rapidly converting to wind and tide and solar. Next slide. So fracking produces methane gas. So if we go to the next slide, then we'll talk a little bit about why that's important. So here's our energy sources in the UK as of 2021, compiled by the UK government. And we can see that in the red, we use lots of oil, 32% of oil for all the energy we use. And obviously that's quite a lot of that's for transport, cars, boats, planes, trains, and quite a lot of that's maybe 5–10% of that, maybe more, goes to making petrochemicals and plastics. We use very little coal on the green on the corner there. We use, strangely, very little renewables, primary electricity and bioenergy. Those are pre-existing renewables. So the actual wind we use is about, which is very popular and very high profile, the wind power, which is busy being built, is only about 5 to 10% of the whole pie here, i.e. it's half of that light blue. And the majority of what we use is gas, methane gas, 43%. And right now, we're living through a period of very high gas price, and that's what's rekindled a lot of interest in fracking to ask the question, can you drill quickly and produce a lot of oil and gas from directly underneath your feet, from shale gas in particular, underneath the UK? And that's been bound up with the conflict in Russia and the cessation of oil and gas supplies into Europe from Russia, which were about maybe 5 to 10% of global supply. So we'll speak about a little bit about that. The UK, of course, only gets very little of its supply directly from Russia, only 2–3% directly from Russia. No, but of course, we're in the European market for oil and gas, and that's why that's influenced us. Next slide, please. I'll come back to that again at the end. So what's the difference between shale gas for fracking and conventional oil and gas? So on this diagram, you can see on the top right there, there's a black line saying coal bed methane, and that's methane gas or fire damp or coal seam methane, which occurs in some coal mines. It can be drilled and extracted at the same time as you're drilling, hopefully before you're extracting coal, but that's a source of methane. Going a little bit deeper on the left, then conventional oil and gas, drilling down, looking for fluid liquid oil in a structure underground, looking for gas floating above that. That's in porous rock where the gas and oil sit in tiny pore spaces between the sand grains. But what we're talking about here with fracking is the very bottom one here, where that borehole unconventional oil or gas well goes right down and drills into the shale, into the brown layer. And that brown layer is the organic rich layer, which has been there through geological millions of years and has produced the oil and gas inside that rock. And usually we've waited for that oil and gas to be to move out of that shale and be accumulated as the liquid we've been extracting for decades and decades. But the fracking drills into that rock and tries to artificially crack and open up pathways for the gas to flow out of that rock. So the difference is we're not dealing with a derived fluid, we're going straight to the source, if you like. Next slide, please. So in the UK, we've got quite a diverse geology, and but two of the more important layers are in the Jurassic, about 150 million years old. And those rocks occur widely in the North Sea, offshore to the east of this diagram, and that's what most of our oil and gas is produced from, or most particularly our oil, of course, from the Jurassic. And that occurs onshore. There are a swathe of small onshore oil and gas fields down in the south of England there. And but that's not what I'm primarily interested in at the moment. I'm interested in the central part of England there. On the east side, there are again some small oil and gas fields in the Jurassic, but this central part of England is now underlain by the Carboniferous age rocks which most people usually associate to be coal-bearing, but also have in the older parts of the Carboniferous have a lot of shales, a fine-grained rock containing lots and lots of organic material. And so that's where a lot of exploration for shale gas has occurred in that central part of England. And then in the red part up in Scotland, where we are sitting at the moment, then there's a big red blob in there, and that is circled around, again, Carboniferous age rocks, shales, which are very, very organic rich. And as we'll see, those were mined, physically extracted to produce oil from shale in the historical past, 100 years ago. Next slide, please. And so where does the shale gas come from? Well, if you could see it underground, it's thin bedded layers of rock like those ones on the right in this river gorge in Lancashire. And those are layers of sandstone, the thin white beds, and layers of the dark mudstone where the organic material is from 300 million years ago, or 350 million years ago in this particular case. And it's that organic material which has been buried, has been heated, and produces oil or produces gas. And in this part of the world, the ancient geography is shown on the left there. All this blue ornament, blue color, is covered over the land. The present-day land area was covered over by a sea, Carboniferous age sea, which was pretty much a subtropical sea, same sort of climate as the Bahamas has now. And within that are high bits and low bits. And some of the low bits you might see at the bottom of the blue, Gainsborough Trough, Widmerpool Gulf, those accumulated very, very thick layers of organic rich shale and mud rock. And then slightly to the left, where there's some complicated writing next to the Craven Basin, then that's where the test drilling has occurred for shale gas in the UK. And again, underneath this deep sea, often very low oxygenation at the bottom, accumulating lots and lots of oil or gas prone rock, which would later be buried and turn into generating oil or gas. Next slide, please. And in Scotland, our rocks were the oil shales and still are the oil shales. And the remnants of those oil shales are seen to the west of Edinburgh. This lower left picture is 5 shale bings, heaps of shale which have been dug out from underneath the ground. There's a black organic rich rock. You can see the miners of that shale in the upper left picture, digging out that oil shale And then that was sent to basically small-scale chemical works, which originated in the 1850s, was heated, and that heating drove off the extra oil. Extra heating drove off the oil, drove off the wax, drove off the paraffins, and those were turned into all sorts of medicinal products, into candle wax, into oils, and eventually into petroleum and diesel to run cars with. And so it's a very boring looking rock on the lower right. That's in a museum. It's just black, and it's just black because it contains up to a fifth of that rock can be carbon. So it's very, very rich. So the oil shales in Scotland were a precursor to this shale fracking industry, because digging up the oil shale is slow, but it proves that there was lots of oil shale there, and it proves that it could generate additional oil out of those rocks. So why not think about drilling that in the future? Next slide, please. So the oil shale industry closed down here in 1965. So we'll just jump 10 or 20 years now and just go through what fracking is. So fracking is shown by this cross section here, a slice through the earth. On the left there, we've got a derrick for an oil rig on the land, and that's drilling down through the layers of rock. You can see the blue layers of the drinking water aquifers near the surface, where we humans get a lot of our drinking water and a lot of our industrial water. So that's got to be safeguarded very, very rigorously, because if the drinking water is contaminated, it can take centuries to clean that up. So the holes for fracking drill down through that. They put down metal casing around the hole, cement the metal casing around the hole so that that is completely watertight and gas tight, in fact. The hole continues down and then strangely bends horizontally. And you may remember on the picture of where oil and gas comes from, you could see that horizontal hole drilling through the brown layer of rock. And this hole drills through the brown layer of rock, drills through that shale, that organic rich rock, and then into that borehole, into that open borehole, are inserted a sequence of tools. And some of those tools can like inflate and block up the borehole. So you put one towards the bottom of the borehole and one maybe 100 meters further up than that, and block off the borehole. And then you inject into that blocked off zone, you inject water at very, very high pressure. And you inject water at a large enough pressure that it actually breaks the rock. That's the process of fracking. It effectively breaks the rock, and if you continued a little bit more, it would actually lift up the surface of the earth. So the pressures pumped in are immense pressures, and the rock is well understood to be blown apart by those pressures. We can do experiments in the laboratories to measure those pressures very precisely. We can do experiments down a borehole geologically to simulate that and measure the pressures very precisely. So we know exactly what pressures are needed to make those fractures. And those fractures then designed to move only maybe 5, 10, 15 meters away from the borehole to stay within the shale rock. So diagrammatically here, those thin wiggly lightning streaks, if you like, on the bottom there, are shown diagrammatically, those fractures staying within the shale, where we want to break that open and allow the gas to flow through the fractures. And on the inset there, we can see the blue fluid, water-based fluid, with the white arrows showing that being pumped in, breaking the rock apart. And then that's usually carrying some sand with it, some special proppant, some small particles, which then prop open the fractures and allow the gas to flow out. And the black arrow there, the two black arrows, are diagrammatically the gas flowing out and flowing into that borehole, and the borehole brings the gas to the surface. And so that's the process of fracking. Now, that requires large amounts of water. That requires a control of the underground, which most people can't see, so can be a bit nervous about. That requires pumping in the water. It requires bringing the water back to the surface to allow the gas to flow. It relies on disposing of that water, and it relies on doing all those calculations correctly enough that you don't break the whole system and lift up the surface of the earth or cause earthquakes. And all of these things are features which I'll touch on briefly in a moment. Next slide, please. So I showed you that diagram of the cartoon of fracking, And this diagram here is still a cartoon, but it's rather more realistic in terms of its depth. And what I'm showing here on this cartoon is again the vertical borehole going down from the surface, going through layers of rock, and then turning horizontal near the bottom of the diagram to drill horizontally through just one particular layer of rock. And the point I'm trying to make with this diagram is that that layer of rock where we're doing the fracking is hundreds of meters below the land surface, maybe even 2,000 meters below the land surface. So that those fractures, which are generated artificially by pumping in water, those are confined or designed to be confined to that thin or that layer of organic rich rock. But of course, the Earth is interconnected. And so even though those fractures may only break the rock close by to the borehole, the push from that fracturing and the push from injecting that extra water transmits through the whole body of rock. And it's quite clear that in several places in the world, including parts of England, that body of rock overlying it is ready to break. It's already stressed and pushed and pulled enough by Earth forces that it's ready to break. And so sometimes when that extra water is injected to artificially frack down below, that extra pressure push can trigger and produce fractures in the rock overlying that, which would have happened anyway, but have been brought forward in time, have been accelerated. And those are the minor earthquakes, which people are very concerned about, and with some reason. We'll come on to those in a minute. So next slide. So that tries to put the scale in perspective there. So let's think about some of the issues then I've talked about briefly. And one of the first ones is I've talked about how we need to put in large quantities of water. And obviously to undertake the fracking, that's pumped in with literally 10 or 12 or maybe even more very, very large trucks which carry compressors on their back, larger than oil tankers in the UK. And those trucks produce huge amounts of pressure, crack the rock, but then need to recover the water because the water's stopping the gas from coming out of the deep underground. So that water is recovered from the underground. And in fact, usually only about 75% of the water is recovered from underground. The other 25% remains lost underground, filling up minor fractures and cracks and being injected into the pore space. But that water which is recovered is then wastewater, so-called flowback water. And that wastewater is contaminated. So on a drilling site, like this one on the left-hand side, on a drilling site, there'll be an array of tanks designed to temporarily hold that flowback water. And that flowback water may contain gas, it may contain oil, so it needs to be filtered and cleaned from that, and the gas needs to be either captured or more usually, unfortunately, flared off, which is environmentally damaging, of course. The water in those tanks as water then carries the chemicals which are injected with the fracking fluid, may carry some sand, but it's also picked up lots of other contamination and content from being deep underground, even if it's only been deep underground in the rock layers for a week or two or a month or two. It's picked up metals in solution, it's picked up salts in solution. Both of those can be toxic, including occasionally in organic rich shales, radioactive elements, naturally radioactive elements, toxic metals and salts, and not least, of course, salt, sodium chloride, because a lot of the deeper groundwater in the world is sodium chloride, salty. It's saline aquifers which cannot be drunk by people. So that water cannot be dumped into the environment because it's too toxic, it's too contaminated, it's not clean at all. So that needs to be stored until somebody can take it away. And you've then got a choice of either cleaning it by evaporating the water and leaving the solids and the contaminants behind. And that's sometimes done in the United States. But there's no facilities for that in the UK at all at the moment. So if the fracking industry was to develop in the UK, then very large numbers of water cleanup plant would need to be built, because you can't put this wastewater, very saline, very toxic metal contamination wastewater cannot go into a normal sewage system. So one option is to clean that up chemically and then discharge the pure water back into the surface water system. And another option on the right here, which is taken in the United States a lot of the time, is to inject the saline water deep underground. And here's an example where that saline water has been injected deep underground through the layers of rock. You can see the drinking water aquifers near the surface. So it's been injected deep, deep down, 2-3 kilometers down, at the base of the sedimentary column, the base of the sedimentary rocks. And those sedimentary rocks overlie much older crystalline rocks, which are fractured and broken. And in this particular part of the world where this has been occurring in Oklahoma, then after a couple of years of injecting that wastewater fluid, it turned out there was a few earthquakes. After 5 years of injecting wastewater fluids in very, very large tonnages, of course, there were quite a few earthquakes. After maybe 7-10 years of injecting wastewater, there were very large earthquakes. And of course, the wastewater has pressurized the underground and has triggered and developed lots of earthquakes, which would have happened maybe in 5 years' time, maybe in 500 years' time, or maybe even 5,000 years' time. But it's brought those to the here and now. And those are large earthquakes, which even in the United States, a land of sparse regulation sometimes, that's been then disapproved of, it's been investigated, and this operation has really been scaled down almost to termination point now to stop that earthquake occurrence happening. Next slide. And we can think about that in terms of water volumes, about how much water was involved. And in the United States, then, I understand this is words and numbers, but for each fracture stimulation in a borehole, you use about 2 swimming pools worth of water. One fracking borehole might have 7 different packed off compartments. So you're using maybe 8 million gallons of water, maybe 5, 10, 15 swimming pools. And that's for one well. And in the fracking operations, you're drilling tens of wells a week around the country, hundreds of wells a year, thousands of wells a year. So these are very, very large disposal operations of water. So not surprisingly, that's had adverse environmental effects in the United States. So if the UK decided to do that, the UK would have to think very carefully about whether it wants to go to the expense of chemically cleaning the water or whether it wants to undertake the risk of injecting the water. The current oil industry onshore in the UK does pump a lot of water on the right-hand side. So it pumps huge quantities of water, much, much more than the oil it produces. So large quantities of water can be shifted, but the difference is that with fracking, you're pumping in extra water, whereas with the oil and gas, you're extracting water and replacing the produced oil with the equivalent water. So you don't increase the net volume. Whereas with fracking, you have increased the net volume of wastewater disposal. Next slide, please. So here we can see earthquakes, lots and lots of earthquakes in the UK. All those red dots are natural earthquakes, and those are the historic measured earthquakes since 1970s up to 2019. If you peered closely at that diagram on the left, you'd find a few blue dots around the coalfields in central England, the former coalfields, and those are induced earthquakes where those have been caused by coal mining, and taking out the coal has let the roof of the coal mine collapse down, or controlled collapse after the coal was extracted, and that's caused earthquakes. But there are none of these earthquakes that I've just talked about in North America. On the right, we can see a map of the earthquakes, of the ground acceleration, the effect of earthquakes in the United States during, I think, 2018. And you can see on the west coast, obviously that's natural seismicity, San Andreas fault, edge of the continental plate, etc. But in the Midwest, on the right-hand side, you can see that bullseye. That's where the wastewater was being trucked to from the East Coast, from all around the United States. And that's the earthquake zone produced by the injection of that water. So a really major human effect. Next slide, please. So no doubt that fracking can cause earthquakes. If we translate that to a smaller scale here in the UK, as I mentioned earlier on, we had 2 trials of drilling for fracking in Lancashire, run by a company called Quadrilla. The first session of drilling in 2011, unexpectedly to them, produced earthquakes, though personally I think the earthquakes could have been anticipated fairly readily, but unanticipated by the company, produced 2 earthquakes which were felt by people at the surface. Not big earthquakes at all, but because that had not been predicted, that was something out of the ordinary. And that caused a huge reaction amongst local communities and eventually amongst politicians, and led to a suspension of activity of fracking in the UK for about 7 years. And then the same company, Quadrilla, went back into one of its boreholes in 2019, having had 7 years to think about the science and engineering of this, and started to undertake the fracking process. Here you can see the timeline on the bottom, August 16th, 2019. The number of earthquakes, the size of the earthquake, if you like, the energy shown vertically. Green initially, just grumbling away, tiny tremors, nobody could feel those. It has to be instrumentally measured. Yellow tremors got up to 0.5. That's not felt at the surface, but that was the agreement, I think, in the intervening period, that if fracking produced earthquakes which could be measured at this level or above, then the fracking would stop stop for 24 hours and see what happened. So several of those episodes happened. An earthquake large enough to trigger the warning system, the so-called traffic light system, red for stop, and then 24 hours restarted the fracking, injecting pressurized fluid. But the really interesting thing, or scary bit, is that on the top line you can see big sized red dots, and the big sized red dots are larger in earthquake magnitude, much larger energy, and you can see those are systematically increasing in terms of energy and getting larger earthquakes. And that turned out, of course, to be totally not predictable where those earthquakes would happen along the drilling borehole or in the surrounding area, not predictable how big the earthquake was, and not predictable when it would occur. And so for that reason, there was a moratorium, a long-term moratorium has been placed on fracking in the UK, because the earthquakes were perceived of as being too difficult with public perception and potentially dangerous to deal with. And of course, this was just before an election, which of course politicians pay attention to public opinion quite well at that time. So earthquakes definitely caused by fracking in the UK, because in England, in this part of England, the rocks are at that balance point, that about to crack position. Next slide, please. So Midland Valley in Scotland was a depositional area. Talk about where people might look in the Midland Valley for fracking. I'm now briefly going to talk about that. In the Carboniferous, the ancient geography shown on the left, a big blue area. It was a large freshwater lake, static, stagnant, accumulating lots of organic material in the bottom. And here's a cross-section on the bottom for the geology of those rocks accumulated at the time. And we're interested in that pale green layer, the West Lothian oil shale, which you can see is fairly horizontal to the west and then goes down a deep sedimentary basin on the right-hand side of the east of that diagram. So that rock can be found at all sorts of different depths, and that is the rock which contains the historic oil shales I talked about. So not surprisingly, oil geologists looked at that and said, well, if those oil shales had been buried a bit deeper, they'd be generating oil. They'd be maybe generating some gas. We could drill those and do fracking. Next slide. So where would you drill for fracking? Well, the British Geological Survey was tasked with trying to evaluate geographically where the most suitable places would be. And that's a combination of looking for the right rock at the relevant depth of burial at the right temperature. And so their survey area was shown by the big purple line around the whole area here, which consists of Glasgow and Edinburgh, the 2 major cities in central Scotland. The area in which contained possible shale gas is shown by the red line, and then the area where you could investigate for shale oil, more valuable shale oil, is shown by two blue lines inside the red line. So you can see it's quite possible to identify the areas of interest before you've started drilling. And it was calculated by the British Geologic Survey that these areas could hold huge quantities of oil or gas. And that's the interest right now about, with a global high price of oil and gas, is it not cheaper to drill for our own oil and gas domestically? But there's a problem, of course. There's usually a problem that what British Geologic Survey calculated was the maximum quantity of oil and gas. And that's not the same as the quantity of oil and gas which is there now, because a lot of that oil and gas turns out to have leaked away. And so further analysis have been done and suggest that on recovered real rock samples, and those further analysis suggests that only maybe 5 to 10% of the original oil and gas still remains there. The rest has leaked away during the past 350 million years. Next slide. And that's the publication showing you the laboratory analysis on the top line there. So that's a really major dent in the optimistic interpretations of huge resources of oil and gas beneath the UK. And that's backed up as well by the very simple observation that there's very, very few oil and gas fields onshore in the UK. Conventional oil and gas fields are present, but are tiny, are small, and have mostly been completely exhausted, producing only a few years of supply for a local town. And that's completely unlike the very large oil and gas provinces in the United States, or the shale, where you can predict shale oil and successfully explore for shale oil. So this petroleum oil and gas system was here, but has, I think, has leaked away, and we're only left with the remnants, the dregs of that oil and gas in those tiny fields. And then the last thing I want to talk about briefly is, if we're to drill for oil and gas in the UK, that's being touted right now as being a potential solution to our supply shortage and our high price. So if we could drill on land, why couldn't we just produce oil and gas very cheaply and then decrease the price for everybody? So there's two types of objection to that. First is of course, the environmental objection that we're supposed to be trying to transition out of oil and gas and coal into renewables. So actually the last thing you want to do is produce more and more oil and gas. You should be investing in energy efficiency instead, in insulation of houses, and developing renewable wind power and solar power for electricity at low carbon cost. So that would be one type of issue I'd have with that. And the second type of issue is the purely mechanistic issue, that to drill and scale up to supply a significant amount of gas to the UK needs huge numbers of boreholes. If you count the boreholes in the United States, they're in the thousands and tens of thousands. So if we're starting from nothing, to scale up the UK industry would require drilling tens of boreholes in the first year, low hundreds in the second year, significant hundreds in the third year. And by year 10, year 8 to year 10, you'd need to be drilling maybe 1,000 boreholes a year. So each of the drilling sites which had been developed for drilling in any of these areas, whether it be central England or whether it be Scotland, and each of these drilling sites would be drilling all year, all the time, to replace the wells, which need to be replaced about every 2 or 3 years, because a shale well is drilled, it produces lots and lots of oil and gas for 2 or 3 years and then dies away to an economically useful trickle, but much, much less than in the first 3 years. So you need to scale up by drilling lots and lots of boreholes. And of course, that's difficult in the UK because we have no drilling rigs which do that. It's difficult in the UK because we have no crews who are trained, no training of the crews to do that. We've got offshore drillers, which is similar, but nothing to do with these very large numbers of trucks bringing in to do the high pressure stimulation and fracking of the underground. And of course, all those people need to be trained. The procedures need to be evaluated. There used to be the usual health and safety. So like, if it's like any other normal development, including planning permission from the local council, and if it's like any other normal development, starting today, you'd be looking at 3 years or 5 years before you got your first boreholes drilled. And so by the time you'd extracted significant amounts of gas then this present crisis will have been long past. So again, I think the perceptions of timing, or the actual arithmetic on timing, is really important in a lot of this. Next slide, please. I'll just pass over that and and then just linger on the last two here, just to say that, remember I showed you a slide to say that we use about a third of our energy is from gas in the UK. And this shows you the gas transport networks around the world from a couple of years ago, from 2020. And you can see that gas is now transported worldwide by shipping. It's no longer a local market. And so the gas we buy comes from Norway, the gas we buy comes from Qatar, and the gas we buy also comes from the United States now, from their shale gas and conventional gas production. But what's happened in between 2020 and now, as well as the conflict in Russia, is also that those economies in the Far East of Japan, of Malaysia, of China, have a huge requirement for gas. So instead of gas coming out of Qatar and turning west to us, the gas comes out of Qatar and turns right for the Far East because they pay more. So even if we get through this little local supply hiccup we've got just now, there's still going to be a long-term problem in the rate of gas supply globally. Next slide, please. And we can see that if we look at the price of gas in Europe from 2021, January 2021 on the left, equivalent to $85 a barrel of oil, to its peak, equivalent to something like $500 a barrel of oil. And then the gas price today is quite low, or still a lot more than it was in 2021, but relatively low. But a lot of that has coincided not just with the Russian conflict, but with the breakdown and non-operation of the largest liquefied gas export from the United States. And that's been totally under-recognized. I think that our media tend to blame everything on the Russian conflict, whereas actually there are other things going on at the same time. And so there are several conspiring things influencing together all of these problems to produce a high gas price. Next slide, please. And what we're lacking in the UK is storage of energy. And in the old days, here's a coal fuel power station. We used to have literally a year's worth of coal piled next to that power station. Now we can map out the gas supply storage in Europe. And on the right-hand side is the histogram of that. And you can see that countries like Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and France have 2 or 3 months of gas supply stored in their country, whereas the UK has 2 or 3 days of gas supply stored. So for that reason, we're always having to buy gas irrespective of the price, whereas Italy, Russia, Germany, France have bought at low prices in the summer and keep that low price gas to use during the winter. So we've had strategic mismanagement by about 10 or 15 years worth of UK governments, not for want of being told by academics, but they've never acted upon it, just based on the theory that you can always buy whatever you want cheaply. And of course, if everybody else wants it as well, you can't. Next slide. I think probably the last one. That's it. That's all I've got to say. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, Stuart. That's quite informative. I think the questions I'd like lined up just in case. I think we've actually gone through quite a few of them already. If anyone would like questions of their own as a result of the chat as well, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll pick them up. So sort of looping back on sort of like the whole sort of the mechanism of fracking that you could have covered at the beginning. So like you were saying before, that like the fracking fluid, like you have some sand in there, and so like what typically drives like the stuff that they pump down into these sort of fracking sites? Is it like to give it more pressure, or make like so that gas can escape?
Well, I'm not quite sure of your question.
No,
so.
it's just the composition of the fracking fluids that they tend to pump through down into the.
Well, the fracking fluid is designed to do several things, and I think there's a lot of because the companies in the United States were very commercially conservative and didn't reveal what was in their fracking fluid, everybody imagined lots of desperately bad stuff in the fracking fluid. Because if you don't tell people the truth, then they imagine the worst case for themselves. But most of the ingredients in the fracking fluid are quite actually standard chemicals, which you would use, you would readily use if you read the back of a shampoo bottle. You're going to put much worse chemicals than that on your head every week.
Yeah.
So the design of the fracking fluids to do several things. Firstly, it's to stop corrosion and reaction with elements down the bottom of the hole, because you don't want to precipitate gels or particles in the hole chemically. So stopping reactions with iron in particular, so you don't get rusty flakes or gel flakes, but also to make the fracking fluid less viscous, to make it more runny, so that it can be pushed into small fractures, but also to have a certain amount and to make it wet onto the surface of the rock. In fact, actually, it's a technical term. So it can smear over the surface of the rock rather than forming lots of little droplets on the rock, so it can contact with the rock. And then also to have enough viscosity in the fluid so that it supports and carries the sand grains with it, which you want to go into those fracture holes to keep the fracture cracks open enough for the gas to seep out. So it's a combination of features to do that. And of course, it usually contains biocide as well to kill any bacteria down the hole, because if you're trying to keep the hole open for a period of months or years, then you don't want lots of bacteria forming bacterial slime and gel in the hole, because that stops the gas coming out.
Yeah, I suppose because like the bulk of fracking in the current day is mostly in the US, I imagine that's where most of the sort of development in these kind of like the compositions. And I guess also each company, like you mentioned, has their own sort of like special brew. They
vary the special brew for the particular rock they're going to be fracking. So it does vary by company, but also by if you're drilling rock type X in Pennsylvania, then it will be a different mix to if you're drilling rock type Y over in Ohio or somewhere, or in New York. So that varies. And I've forgotten the other part of your question.
I'm trying to think. I can't think. But like, so the main thing I was going to follow it on with was just sort of like, because of sort of this cocktail of like sands and chemicals and water. Is there much of a so like, because the main topic as well, like at the present day, is also around the sort of like climate change and everything, like, and so the environmental impact of fracking, as accurate or not, there may be, depending which stories you're kind of listening to. Is there much research, or do we know that if they're like looking towards like more sort of, I guess, environmentally friendly sort of
fracking mixtures? So I think, well, again, although it's been difficult to know what fracking fluid compositions were 10 or 15 years ago, there's absolutely certainly in the United States and elsewhere a move to be much more open about listing what compounds in fracking fluid, because that decreases the scariness of it, and that therefore produces trust, and which produces permission to operate for the company. And so that move to transparency or openness, I think, will stay. And in the UK, a place like the UK, that fracking fluid will be monitored, will be analysed by the Environment Agency or by the Health and Safety Executive, depending on which bit you're working with. And they don't disclose the ingredients, but they know what the ingredients are. So they check that the analysis fits with what the company claimed it's going to be. So there are safeguards in the UK for doing that. And having said all that, I think it's important to realise that fracking is really common. Fracking is ubiquitous in the North Sea, but it's with much smaller volumes of fluid in vertical boreholes, which tend to be vertical in conventional holes, And the fracking there just fractures maybe 2 or 3 or 4 meters around a borehole going through a sandstone or a limestone, which is a porous rock. So you're not trying to frack for multiple hundreds of meters through a shale like you are with this high volume fracking we've been talking about. You're just trying to enhance the flow around a particular borehole. And that's happening today, and that's been going on for 30 years, 50 years or so. So there's actually, there's also a lot of, and I guess, a certain element of misinformation or choosing which information you have. But it's undoubtedly the case that although fracking has occurred, this is a different type of fracking. So this does raise different concerns, and people are right to ask for information.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping that, like, because there's much more of an eye on it in the UK after all the sort of like all the stuff that sort of happened in the US. That, like, do you think hopefully that like regulations and oversight in the UK is sort of, I guess, strong enough if we do end up deciding to try and like pursue fracking?
Yeah. So again, this is bound up with the question of should you be doing it anyway in terms of climate change, to which the answer is no, in my opinion. But that's nothing to do with the regulation about fracking directly. And I think the regulation in the UK is tight, and the regulation in the UK is very likely to provide a safe environment, technically safe environment for fracking to occur. But then you also have the features which are not just the technical bit. It's about, do you want the fields, 2 or 3 fields near you, to be developed into small industrial complexes with 24-hour day drilling 6 or 7 days a week for 10 years with 5 or 6 truck movements coming out maybe every day, with a certain amount of noise and clanging, with a workforce who are very unlikely to be local, so very unlikely to be giving a lot of long-term benefit to the community. All those other aspects of industrialization of the perceived green and pleasant land go with fracking as well. And again, I think people tend to choose their own historical context as well to see that in, because one person's green and pleasant land would be an industrial archaeologist's former coal mining area, would be somebody else's opportunity to gain huge quantities of national resource and monetary wealth. That's why there's so much conflict around this. And the conflict also, I think, came because Quadrilla, being the first company to try developing this in the UK, weren't very straightforward with the public at the start of it. So Quadrilla was founded by something like 5 or 6 reputable academic geologists who did quite a good job on understanding that there could well be a shale gas resource in the UK and there could well be a shale oil resource in the UK. But once they'd done their job on that, I think basically they were bought out by the larger company, which became called Quadrilla that we know of, which was backed by venture capitalists. And the job of the Quadrilla there was to drill holes and to try and produce oil and gas as fast as possible. And that's why they went ahead with perhaps less geological circumspection and less geological investigation than might have been wise. And so the fact that they caused earthquakes in their first drilling operation without pre-warning the public, and without a clear strategy for monitoring, and without a clear strategy for remediation, it didn't take very long for the internet public to match up this operation with what happens in the United States and make lots of claims about what could happen and what might happen and what spectres could definitely emerge. And again, the lack of information enables people to produce their own worst case information and project that onto the problem. Because the basic fact is, although there have been thousands of boreholes drilled in the United States, there is very, very little evidence for large scale or significant water contamination. So there's lots and lots of conversation and heat and energy about that, but the actual number of occurrences are almost fingers of one hand or two hands compared with the thousands and tens of thousands of boreholes which have been drilled.
Yeah, I suppose because it's just like it's so far below the water level.
Yes.
I guess unless you'd have to be doing it fairly shallow, or I suppose to have any risk.
Yeah, so no doubt that fracking at shallower depth is much more risky because you have a greater chance to connect into freshwater or drinking water aquifers. But most of the rocks, the shale rocks, which are, when I say shallow depth, I mean 200 meters, 400 meters shallow depth. Then because that's relatively shallow for a geologist, then a lot of that gas and oil has seeped off slowly over geological time. And that's one of the reasons that all the rocks exposed near to the surface in the UK just now, we think have leaked away their hydrocarbons. So and that's why most of that shale resource, which was predicted in 2011 and predicted by the British Geologic Survey in 2014, under instructions to calculate the maximum possible resource, they did the correct job, gave the correct answer to the maximum possible resource. But then the developers and the politicians took over and didn't really take on board that there's a big difference between the maximum possible resource and the commercially accessible, profitable reserves, which might actually still be there. And usually you divide at least by 10 to get from one to the other. And of course, in the rush to be enthusiastic about making money, then caution was not exercised. Yeah. So that's why the rumor wagon of vast riches and wealth, so that rumor wagon started to roll, and that created even more opposition, of course, because the accusation was you're only doing this for the money.
Yeah, it's kind of that sort of like weird sort of parallel that like all the public tend to be assuming the worst, and then all the people that are after the sort of shale oil and gas are assuming the best possible outcome for themselves.
Yes.
So like one thing I was sort of like, because you mentioned like the maximum capacity, and then like, oh, there's probably like 5 or 10% sort of actually left after this sort of extended period of time. When they do fracking, how much typically do they get out of, like, do they know like how much they're expecting, like once you've started like fracking, do you just keep going until you sort of like run out, like do you know how much gas you're likely to get out? It's like,
well, initially you don't know. So initially, as we briefly alluded to, fracking didn't exist. This high volume fracking didn't exist.
Yeah.
And in the 1990s in the United States, there was quite a lot of money put into improving drilling by the Department of Energy, the government research organization. So justifiably, they can claim to have helped invent this high volume fracking. But of course, there was also a couple of individuals in Texas, experienced drillers who knew that they could probably make this work, but spent a lot of their own time and their own effort in the belief that if they found the right spots in the shale, then they would be able to produce vast quantities of gas. And purely by trial and error drilling of a lot of holes, they established the basic rules of the game in that Barnett shale. And so, but when you're drilling in a new area, like we're effectively drilling in Lancashire, or drilling in the central belt of Scotland, or drilling in the northwest of Ireland, are all new types of geological basin with slightly different rocks in them. So you're hoping and predicting, if you're a developer, you're hoping and predicting that you'll get a strong flow of gas for 2, 3, 4, or 5 years, because you've maybe had to borrow £5 million to drill the hole and frack it, and you need enough hydrocarbon to pay the rent, pay that mortgage back.
Yeah.
And it's quite clear that in the early days in the United States, then people were drilling very fast, one well after another, because they needed to drill a new well, because the first well they drilled hadn't produced very much gas. And so they drilled a second well to try and make more gas, to make more money to pay the rent on the first one. And the second one didn't quite pay enough rent either, so they had to drill a third one. And so there's plenty of calculations which which show that it's certainly financially not as profitable as it's made out to be.
Sounds like quite risky. So it's going to loop back to the like all the sort of like the backflow water that you mentioned before, where you go through all these like hundreds of thousands of gallons of water that sort of get pumped in and then kind of brought back out for like chemical treatment. For that kind of process, like, do they just sort of like during the chemical treating, do they just then you're then left with an amount of pure water, or and like how do they tend to dispose of everything after? Because you had that picture of all the like storage tanks sort of all lined up to hold it during operation.
So it'll depend on the rules and regulations of where you're operating, but certainly in the UK and in the more environmentally advanced states who are looking after their groundwater in the United States and Canada, then the water purity to return back to has to be really pure to return back to a river system or a flowing water system. So I guess effectively it has to be drinking water quality, though I don't know if they describe it in that way. And I said the most difficult part to take out is the salt, strangely enough, the most common mineral. And they have to take out salt to become to a freshwater standard of discharge into a flowing river or a watercourse or a canal. And the difference there is that with a lot of offshore wells in the North Sea, for example, and offshore oil provinces also pump huge quantities of water. Something like 10 times more water gets pumped in a day than oil and gas gets pumped in a day. But they're able to, as long as they've cleaned up the hydrocarbons, the oil and gas, out of the water that they've brought back up to the surface, then if you're offshore operating, you've got salty seawater and you can put that back in the salty seawater. So it's easier to do this offshore for conventional oil and gas. So you would never do this, you'd never do this large scale fracking, high volume fracking offshore, just because the flows of gas are not large enough to pay the huge costs of maintaining platforms and drilling offshore holes. Well, as when the price of gas carries on increasing, maybe, but it's a long way away yet.
So do you know, are there other countries as well that have sort of fracking operations? I know like the US is the main one. We've done some exploratory stuff here, but like I guess other countries like where we sort of source our sort of oil and gas from, do they do fracking at all? I don't know. Like, is it
well, what you need for
than
fracking is a large set of really quite simple rocks which are rich in organic material. So you're after parts of the world which have got a flat geology, layered, very continuous rocks, very simple stuff. And that can occur in parts of Switzerland in front of the Alps. Though I hasten to say, I don't think the Swiss are doing anything on fracking at all. And it does occur in parts of South Africa. They've drilled for fracking, but I don't think they've discovered that much. And then Argentina is the place which people often talk about as being a next fracking frontier, as long as, if they can get some purchasers to give them guaranteed sales, then large parts of Argentina have the correct type of geology. But at the moment, fracking is totally dominated by the United States. A bit goes across the border into Canada, into the southern parts of Canadian provinces. And I guess it's not really taken off elsewhere. So countries like France or Germany or Poland have all been drilled for fracking investigations, and they haven't found enough to be worthwhile bothering with the technical risks and worthwhile bothering with the huge amount of public engagement which you're going to have to do as a fracking company to convince the citizens of the country that you're actually doing something sensible and good, rather than putting the same amount of money into windmills and photovoltaics, was probably got a much better long-term energy production.
Yeah, I think it's just a lot of unknowns around it.
Well, there's a lot of knowns. There's a lot of knowns. And, and again, there's plenty of developers out there who would like to continue business as usual and drill for hydrocarbons. So like I said, right at the beginning of the presentation, this is, to me, is part of what we actually decide to do on these things, is part of the energy transition which we're undergoing. So, for example, INEOS, the chemical company who runs Grangemouth Oil Refinery, about 40 kilometres west of Edinburgh, INEOS used to import a lot of ethylene from the North Sea. They have a dedicated ethylene pipeline to bring that particular chemical, that particular hydrocarbon down from the North Sea, where they'd sourced it from particular fields which were rich in ethylene. That's now run out. So they can close the chemical works or not. And what they decided to do was to build a fleet, a small fleet, maybe, I can't remember, 10 of what they call dragon boats, which are tankers which bring ethylene across from the United States to eastern Scotland, and that's what feeds the refinery now. And that's a manifestation that established businesses really quite like to carry on doing the business that they're good at. So change is slow, and but change needs to happen. But change, I think, will actually take longer than we think. But not developing large quantities of shale gas and shale hydrocarbon, not doing that is a positive move in favour of transitioning. Whereas if you just carry on drilling and drilling and drilling, you'll get fewer and fewer and fewer returns. And at the end of the day, then you'll end up having to either be very chilly and cook your food over a wood fire, or to transition to very expensive, very rapidly built ways of producing energy. So I'm in favour of a slow and measured and properly organised transition, which is sort of what's happening in the UK, though it's starting to turn into something slightly more complicated than was originally anticipated. But the country still is progressing. We have reduced our carbon emissions by half per person in the UK since 1990.
That's really good.
And that's without any, and that's why we've still increased our standard of living. So it manifestly is possible to have a better quality of life with less carbon emission.
So I mean, that's so I think that's the thing as well. Like, you kind of do start seeing headlines as well for like a lot of the renewables and stuff are kind of like becoming more sort of like popular headlines of like, oh, countries or like Scotland, like Australia as well, where they've been sort of replacing a bulk of their sort of like, not all the time, because it's sort of like they're sort of independent resources at the moment, but they've been replacing their sort of power draw, offsetting it for like certain days or weeks of the year. Which I think
and we
is a
can
good
claim
thing.
the same, so that but you've got to be very careful of the difference between an average and a spot event. So on average, and Scotland produces more than half its electricity now. I think maybe it's up to 70% from renewable sources, from wind and PV, but that's on average. But during the year, it's also clear that Scotland imports a third of its electricity from England because we need to, because sometimes the wind doesn't blow fast enough and we need to import nuclear powered electricity and gas fueled electricity and even a little bit of coal fueled electricity and plenty of wood fueled electricity from England. And that's because we haven't become very good at storing our energy yet. Like I mentioned briefly, if we could produce lots of energy in the summer and store that through to the winter, and then use that to even out the supply, then that becomes a much more renewable system, and we can rapidly dispose of gas burning power stations, which will rapidly dispose of our reliance on international trade from countries which may be reliable or may not be reliable as partners in trade for energy sources. I think the future looks like being a much bigger premium, a much bigger attention paid to security and resilience about your own energy supplies. That may be producing domestic oil and gas for some countries, but for other countries like the UK and Scotland, hopefully that will be producing more renewables and finding ways to store that renewable energy from the summer to the winter.
Hopefully we make more progress on that regard as well, like as we're sort of trying to transition to a sort of more ecologically sort of viable like power sources.
Yeah.
So you were saying as well, like, so most of our current usage is gas. Is gas typically, I guess, is that more environmentally sort of friendly as an option, given that they tend to be like a whole pipeline to sort of like getting it like from a fuel source into like working to create power as well.
So if methane, and when we say gas, that's usually meaning methane gas.
Yeah.
And so if it's produced and transported correctly, then methane gas clearly has half the carbon emission per unit of power compared against coal. So in that sense, it's a good thing. Where it gets a bit more, first step of being more complicated is actually you've just switched from one fossil fuel to another fossil fuel.
Yeah.
So you've only half cleaned up. And so you're kidding yourself if you think that's the end of the road. That's just another step on the road of crossing the river, really. But the other major problem with gas is what's becoming apparent is that the pipelines and the equipment which is used to transport the gas quite often isn't very well screwed together. Yeah. So because gas is very low viscosity and it's invisible, then quite a lot of gas leaks out during transit. So, and it's very difficult to do accurate appraisals of that. There's plenty of work been done on looking at the leakage of gas supply for a particular thing, like making motor cars or making Coca-Cola or something. You can analyze the supply chain of that. But overall in gas supply, if we thought about gas supply coming from Russia to Europe, then there's always been plenty of accusations that about 8% of the methane leaked out of the pipes whilst it was in Russia. Yeah. And that's a commercial loss, of course, but it's also an environmental disaster, which you don't actually see immediately, because methane, you remember, is a much more strong greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, something like 26 times stronger. So a couple of percent of methane emitted to the atmosphere through a poorly maintained pipeline is equivalent to doesn't take long till that adds up to the equivalent of using coal again. So you need to be careful what you wish for, but especially you need to be careful about how this is regulated, because the way out of all these things is to ensure that we've got very strong regulation, which is actually enforced. And with the rise of satellites now, particularly with small, low-cost satellites, the size of biscuit tins, then it's now possible to put up into orbit satellites which have got sensors for carbon dioxide and sensors for methane. So the actual monitoring of these pipelines and the monitoring of chemical works and the monitoring of industrial sites now becomes possible on a daily basis through these satellites, and that's what's now starting to happen. And it's then going to be a question of how brave the regulators are to go and confront the company who's emitting an awful lot of methane without necessarily realizing it, to ask them to please, could they clean up their act or get closed down. And so it is ultimately going to rely on enforcement and the perception of that enforcement. As long as there's a perception that you will get caught, then companies will definitely clean up.
Yeah. Imagine for them as well, there's probably like an economic incentive, given that if the product you're transporting is just going off into the air, then you're missing out.
So, no, but when you look at these supply chains of methane in particular, then there are numerous places where methane bubbles away back into the atmosphere. waiting on a tanker of hydrogen, then it might arrive and only be 7/8 full because the rest of it's bubbled off in transit.
Yeah, that's cool. So I'll probably just wrap up with one last one. So I know you mentioned sort of briefly before, like, so we're going through an energy transition, and we're like, it's not happening as fast as we want because we've got all like the sort of environmental accords where we're like, we want to try and get done by these, like, I mean, I want to say optimistic because of like how the climate is changing, and like we're kind of racing against, like, the longer it takes, the more long-term sort of harm that we'll be trying to like offset or recover from. How long would you think that like the transition might take? Based on sort of
The transition from fossil fuel dominance to something more sustainable.
Yeah.
Well, I guess, I mean, it's going to take decades, simply. And of course, this depends how you measure it. So if you want to actually get down to net zero, then that's a lot harder than just getting down to an 80% decrease. And you can see that enthusiasm and activation change in the UK, because the UK is unique, and well, it still was unique and is still very rare amongst international countries, in that we've got a law which dictates how much carbon dioxide we're allowed to, greenhouse gases we're allowed to emit into the atmosphere as a country for 5-year periods between now and 2050, so-called carbon budgets. And it's clear that those can be set in advance, but they're difficult to hit. And so there's lots of conversation about how to progress, but clearly the first 20% was fairly easy. The next 20 to 40% was a bit difficult. We're now thinking, yeah, we can get to 50, 60%, but the serious conversations are now happening. What happens more than 60% decarbonized is getting difficult. And that's when the net zero bit starts to come in, that you could only need to decrease down to 80% decrease. And the last 20%, you might allow yourselves to carry on emitting, provided you capture CO2 somewhere else. And that's the net bit. So it'd be 20% emitted in one place, and then captured in another place and sequestered from that other place. So overall, you still have an overall decrease and reduction down to zero. And that's going to, I think the UK might make that by 2050. I don't think many other countries on the present trajectory are going to make it by 2050. And if you look at previous transitions of technology or energy, then all of those take decades. And the ones which are exceptional and exceptionally rapid are photovoltaic panels, or our mobile phones and motor cars, because the innovation there was readily made lots and lots of times. You could manufacture lots of them and get good at making it and make it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, so that people would buy more and more and more of them. But usually if you want to transition from, let's say, burning coal to totally renewable, then we started off that transition. We started burning a lot of coal about 1910 and 1914 for everything. We'd already burned a lot by then, but we had the idea of starting to get out of coal probably in the early 1990s, and we're still burning coal a little bit today in the UK. So actually getting rid of it all is a really long time.
Yeah.
But we just have to be good enough. Let's not be gloomy. Let's be optimistic that we've
making steps. Yeah, definitely.
Got halfway through decarbonising in the UK without any huge detriment to the population.
Yeah, that's quite a big milestone when you think about it. That's good. Get on a positive note as well. Thank you very much for your time, Stuart. It's been really informative, and it's been great getting to spend an hour or so just hearing about everything you know on the topic and answering our questions.